We continue our conversation today with Australian of the Year nominees, and I'm really pleased today to be able to introduce you to Victoria's finalist, John Caldwell. John has a phenomenal story to tell. From an upbringing centred around violence, alcohol and promiscuous sex, John is now one of Australia's foremost anti-bullying advocates, as well as being an incredibly successful businessman. I'm really pleased to welcome you to the program from the UK today, John, so thank you so much for doing this where it is late in the evening.
Thanks for having me on the show, Liz.
My pleasure. Let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and, I guess, the difficult circumstances you were raised in?
Yeah, home life was quite dysfunctional. My parents were we were extremely poor, and they were both alcoholics. And so there was, as you said, promiscuous sex. There was violence constantly, things that children shouldn't be exposed to. And in their wisdom, they thought it'd be a great idea to buy a bus. So we lived in a bus and travelled from town to town, often moving 6 or 8 weeks at a time. So it was quite a transient lifestyle as well.
Did you have any siblings?
I had 2 sisters, both older sisters.
Mm-hmm. And how, as children, did you guys cope with the transient nature of your life and, the overlay of, alcoholism and violence and that sort of thing?
I think you grow up really quickly and you learn to look out for each other. So, my memories of ever feeling protected actually were from my sister, who's just 2 years older than me, rather than from my parents, who you should feel protection from. So you tend to look out for each other. And for us, though, it was a little bit normal. It wasn't abnormal. It's only as you get older in life and I guess face some challenges and problems of your own that you realise that wasn't the norm.
School was obviously difficult for you. Can you tell me a little bit about your school experience?
Yeah, I can, and I actually really love talking about that, because when I talk about the home and the upbringing, and that culminated actually when I was 11, my father took his life while I was there, and people think that's a horrific story, but actually what caused me even more pain and more grief was the torture I faced at school, and the bullying and the constant torment was more hurtful and has more long-term effects.
Why were you bullied?
It was a range of everything. One was obviously being, often the poorest kid in school. Always, in most schools, the only kid without a uniform, sometimes the only kid without shoes. Couple that with the new kid syndrome that you get anyway, and I had that so often. And then as I started to grow up a little bit, I was starting to get a bit bullied for being gay, which I didn't even know that I was. I didn't really know what that was at the time. So that coupled in, and I think children can be very cruel, and they find anything once you're in the limelight and unpopular and getting picked on. I often talk about how going back to school after my father's suicide, I was a little relieved, thinking these kids will feel sorry for me. And no, that just gave them something else. I was then bullied and told that, your dad killed himself because of you. So the range of things that I was bullied for were horrendous.
John, how do you cope with that when you're just a kid and other kids are saying that to you? What sort of mental process do you go through?
It's very tough. You retreat from the world, and earlier on in life, I had some huge problems at school. I wouldn't put my hand up and ask a question, so the learning became more difficult. You withdraw, you hide back. Teachers would say that I had a learning disability because I wasn't getting good grades and I wasn't participating. But now later in life, having built some successful companies of my own, I can look back and say it wasn't a learning disability. It was just I just didn't want to participate in that environment. So you hide away from the world as much as you can.
Did you have anyone at school, a teacher who reached out to you, or did you have to really go through this yourself?
I really did just go through it myself. I think probably when I started, my earlier work years is when I started to find mentors and some people to look up to. But going through school, I think the fact of not being in a school long enough meant I didn't really develop those sort of strong bonds and relationships with teachers either. Mm-hmm. So it was really just navigate through it yourself.
Obviously, you're trying to make changes in school, and you do so much work now around anti-bullying. Looking back at your own experience, is there anything in particular that you can point to now and say, gosh, if I had have had that, my life would have been so much easier?
Yeah, there's a lot of things I think that could have been different, and the penny dropped for me recently. I'm doing some work with Alana and Madeline Foundation, and they have a really simplistic program called Better Buddies program. And it's as simple as someone a couple of years ahead of you being allocated as your buddy. And when I first heard about this, I thought, well, that's a bit simplistic. But then I realised, someone 2 years older than you just coming into the playground, high-fiving you, checking up on you, someone who's not a teacher that you could say, I'm by myself, and they say, come play with me and my friends. something that simple actually can make such huge generational change. So I really love those sort of programs.
And in your experience, do the kids who are given that responsibility to take care of a child who might be at risk of being bullied or who may be feeling lonely, do they take that responsibility on really well, or do they need help to do that?
They need help, and the program that actually is out in schools is a really good one, and it's quite structured, and the schools buy into it. But I'm amazed to see how well they do take it on. And, kids as young as 10 years old, I'm going to these schools and having really intelligent conversations with them, and they understand it. They understand respectful relationships. They understand how it's not cool to pick on people. And I just wish that these programs might have started a long time ago. It might have been a bit different now.
You left school at 15. What did you do? I mean, hearing your story, it's obvious why you left school when you could. So what did you do when you left school?
It was a crossroads, it was back in a time where if you didn't have a degree, you were never going to be anything. So in my mind at that point, I decided I needed to leave, so I made peace with the fact that I was never going to be anything or achieve anything. But 15 at that point was quite tough. I was homeless, had no school, and I definitely, as 49% of young people today, I contemplated suicide quite seriously. 15 years
Sorry, I sort of pull you up there. 49% of young people contemplate suicide.
Yeah, the stats these days are 49% of people under 25 in Australia have contemplated suicide.
That is phenomenal.
It's really the driving force for me doing the work I'm doing.
Oh, unbelievable. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, it is a shocking figure as well. So, yeah, but at 15, that was the crossroads I came to. And the turning point for me was work. I started in a fast food chain at the very bottom of the barrel and started to realise that I could be good at something. And that became an addiction. Winning the Silly Team Member of the Month awards became an addiction to reinforce that I was okay or I was good at something. And then that grew and took on a life of its own.
So you did that from 15. I just want to... I think, John, your story is absolutely extraordinary. So I want to make sure that we understand, I guess, the full background. You left school at 15. How old were you when your father took his life? 11. And what had happened with your mum in the intervening years?
Mum moved on quite quickly. So within the first year of my father dying, Mum had moved on and had a new boyfriend and moved into the house. And that was another dimension for me because although there was a lot of violence at home, it was directed at my mother, not at me. So I avoided it. The stepfather, however, was a terrible bully towards me, which made it even worse. So bullying came out of the school ground into the home for me then. So it got even worse. So you really had
you had no place of respite?
No place of respite. We lived in Queensland at this point, and we had one of those houses on small stumps. And at sort of 13 years old, I would hide under the house and play matchbox cars just to create my own world and get away from the world that I had to live in.
Your story is just so harrowing. I'm speaking to John Caldwell, who is the Victoria's finalist in the Australian of the Year. So you had no respite, John. Your mother had moved in. You had a stepfather who was incredibly violent towards your mum. There was bullying. Were you ever put into any foster homes or anything like that?
Yeah, so that was in between, I guess, sort of my mother meeting the new man and me eventually leaving home. I was put into a foster care situation. It was an informal arrangement, and it was a degree of normality. It was a normal, happy family. But one of the oldest son of that family and myself ended up being molested by the father of that family. So he also was no escape.
And I said before that this is quite harrowing to hear this story, but on the flip side, we're interviewing you because you're a finalist of the Australian of the Year. You've done amazingly well to turn your life around. So let's go back to when you were 15. You said you got a job at a fast food place. Work became an addiction. How did that early experience contribute to your later success? Because as I mentioned in the introduction, you're an incredibly successful businessman.
It made all the difference. And, I do a lot of talking in school, and I don't encourage kids to leave school. I think if you can stay and get a degree, it's certainly easier than having to do it the other way. But there is another way, and it was really hard work. And, I talk to the kids today and say, if you are going to get a job, you've got to work hard. You can't leave the first time you get offended or upset or, I would volunteer on my days off so that I was there. I was in their face. I was always there. I would pick up shifts that no one else wanted. So, but I loved it because it suddenly was a place where I felt like I belonged. So that training and I guess that discipline has set me up for everything I've done in the workforce ever since.
Mm-hmm. And what you've done, you run a recruitment company, is that right?
Yeah, so after many years of retail and growing through to executive level in retail companies, I did start my own company, and it's a retail recruitment agency. So we provide staff to the retail industry.
Okay, so that's what you do as your day job.
Yeah.
By night, you're an anti-bullying advocate. Tell me a little bit about, I mean, obviously your backstory tells us why you do it, but tell us a little bit about the work that you do and the organisations you're involved in.
It came about because coming from my background, I always thought success was about money and things. So I worked really hard to get lots of money and to buy lots of things. And I bought the newest cars and the best houses. And you eventually start to realise that there's something missing and that maybe that wasn't what it was all about. The work I do as an anti-bullying ambassador is across a number of organisations and a lot of independent stuff. So a lot of working with schools, universities, research programs. And it, much like the work in the early days, just became an addiction. It was just wanting to help people a little bit, and it's taken on a life of its own. So anytime an organisation reaches out to me and they need help or there's an opportunity to make a difference, I just can't say no, and I love it. So I jump right in there.